Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and I will let Edward introduce himself.
Okay, so to give you a little bit of background about myself, I spent most of my life as a U.S. Marine. I've served all around the world, including Afghanistan, and I was over in Bahrain and Kuwait during the first part of that very kind of what I believe is a tragic chapter of American and Middle Eastern history, starting from about 2003 on. Um, but my final tour of duty was as a peacekeeper in South Sudan. And I went there really hoping that this was going to be sort of a way to redeem what I kind of felt was a bit of my complicity in America's long wars, which had not delivered for the things either I think for this country or for certainly the people in Afghanistan and Iraq and some other places that we were operating in. It was quite an eye-opener. It was not what I expected it to be, and this memoir is not what I expected it to be as a result. When I retired, I used my GI Bill to attend a master's program at Harvard Extension, got a graduate degree, the ALM, in creative writing and literature, and did that as most people do whilst doing a graduate diploma in philosophy at the University of Melbourne simultaneously. This was the time of COVID. Everything was remote, and I was traveling around the world, so it kept me busy. And my goal is to use what I learned from both of those courses to kind of deploy my writing skills for good. The pen is supposedly mightier than the sword. For the next 20 or 30 years, I hope to put that to the test and kind of focus on, among other things, sort of what is the failures of modern peacekeeping and what we can do to improve that. And moreover, how we can address the fact that whilst people talk about war crimes, the real crime is war. The fact that it's still considered to be sort of a norm. I have a couple of sisters who are international relations professors, and they tell me this is just the way the world is, that politics by other means is war. But we don't, these days, certainly, we don't say that economics by any other means, it means slavery is okay, or that dating by any other means means that sexual assault is okay. And yet, when it comes to basically murder, we still have this idea that, at a certain point, if talking doesn't work, you can be violent at the state level. So I'm hoping to be able to change that with my writing.
Wow. So one thing before we jump into the questions I had written down, I wanted to ask, philosophy seems such an interesting thing to combine with writing. And so my husband actually has a philosophy degree. He works
Oh,
in
excellent.
IT, but and he got his philosophy degree, 25 some years ago. But he said that's the degree that he uses every day. Whereas he has another degree that he doesn't apply as much. So I'm curious, is like, what is it that led you to philosophy in addition to the creative writing?
So at the philosophy side, I really was very interested in ethics and ethical frameworks. So that was what I was most interested in. It turns out there's bits of philosophy that I don't very much like at all. And one of the issues with the philosophy was that there have been over the years philosophical attempts to justify war as an institution, and actually starts out very early with the Greek philosophers who did equate honorable behavior for men included going to war for your country, going over to kill people in Sparta if you lived in Athens and vice versa. And that was seen as a good thing. And then through the 1500s, the Catholic Church had to explain, there was kind of a crisis. They needed to get the Spanish soldiers to not worry about going to hell whilst they were killing the enemy. So they had to kind of justify, like, how could you do both? And so to see how philosophy has addressed this issue, and that I felt was going to be something I was going to need. So I very much enjoyed that degree. And I too have a degree that I don't use that much. It's mechanical engineering. But it gives me a process-minded way of looking at the world. But I found that of all the filters I use, the ability to think about ethical contexts and to then write clearly, to me, I think that those are my superpowers.
That's fantastic. And you should definitely talk to Aaron sometime because yeah, that's it's the same sort of thing. Like he works in IT, so it's that sort of logical framework supported
Yeah.
by the philosophy. I think that's such an interesting approach. And I think, finding that balance is key, especially with memoir, in, applying framework, but also specifically with memoir in applying factual information with telling a story, because we touched on this a little bit, but nobody wants to read a memoir that reads like a PhD thesis, or at least I don't. Some of people here might, but I don't. So how do you find that balance when you're approaching writing memoir?
So for me, I actually found that memoir was a fairly uh, an easy genre to write in. And I'll tell you that if you look at the short stories I've published before, they're mostly historical fiction. And I find, and as I went through my class with Harvard, the classes that I really enjoyed and did very well in were biography and historical fiction, because they give you a framework. So if you're writing about some battle in World War I, it has a start and an end, and your guy may or may not make it out alive, but the big picture, that's kind of set. So it gives you a framework. And biography is the same way. You might be able to find interesting unknown facts about someone's life, but they were born on this date, more or less. They died on this date, more or less. Memoir sort of does the same thing. It's your framework, and so you can be a little more loose with it. But at least it's my opinion that if you're writing about actual things that you experienced, you still have to kind of hew to your experience. And I'll tell you, there's a very interesting thing that came up in the early editing process. There's a fairly dramatic scene in the book where I meet a woman she's been displaced from her village. She's lost her children and her family members, and she's just in a terrible state. And one of the beta readers' questions was, "What color was her dress? I need to see this woman." And I'm like, I don't know what color her dress was. That was not what I was focused on in the moment. But so there is that thing in some, show don't tell and all these things. And if you know those details, like there's another scene where we're driving through a very remote place, and there's a little girl in a pink dress who waves from a window. And I thought to myself, that's the person we're here trying to make her future life better. So to me, memoir, it gives you that kind of framework. That's why I found it fairly easy to write in it. So in fact, what I found more difficult was word count. When you have a year, you have a lot of adventures, and you have a lot of stories. Maybe you can't fit them all in the same book, and then you've got to decide, okay, what's the real purpose of this book? Is it just to paint, beautiful and interesting pictures, or is it to bring some message? And if it's to bring a message, then you have to kind of pare down what does not serve the story.
That's interesting. So, sort of deciding what to put in and take out based on if it's in service of the larger arc that you're trying to communicate. Yes. I'm curious, in hindsight, now that the book is written, it's being released in just a couple of weeks. Is there anything that you took out, but that you wish you would have left in? Are there any stories that you feel like, should have stayed and you're regretting cutting them? Or do you think that you kind of wound up with what the right stories are?
I think that I wound up with the right set of stories for this book. And I realized that there's basically a whole second book, which is I think very early on, there's a short chapter called, I think, Colleagues, Caveats, and Contingencies. And it touches on the fact that the people that I worked with were just some of the most phenomenal that I've known in about 30 years of military service, from all over the world, many nationalities, different backgrounds, different cultures, just amazing people. And with almost all of them, or certainly like the subset of folks that I hung around with a lot, so many just wonderful, fun, adventurous stories. that unfortunately there just was not when the serious stuff happened, and I suddenly realized how serious it was and how much of the book that was going to eat. So I think that there's a whole second book, but I don't really have any regrets. And I think in my acknowledgments, my first acknowledgement is I want to give a shout out to everybody whose really awesome stories did not make it in, and I owe you another book, and I'll get around to writing that. So not too many regrets at this point.
That's great. You mentioned, I think, some of the classes that you took at the extension school, but are there any particular classes where you would advise aspiring writers in particular, but students more generally at the extension school, like, take this class, do this thing?
Yes. So there's one that if I could potentially just do a quick screen share, because I think sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So maybe I can give you a few thousand really quickly to explain A, why I think this class is very powerful and what it did to help me. But B, also kind of just be a quick scene setter for this book, since most people probably have not read it in full. But would it be okay if I just quickly share my screen? I'll scroll through this really fast.
Absolutely.
Okay, so,
did you want to tell us the class first, or?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So this is a piece of work that I put together in a class that's taught by a lady named Catherine Eden. It's called Art of the Pitch. And while it is it was the hardest class I took and the hardest to get a good grade in, but also the most rewarding. And when we talk about agents and editors, this is one that really helped me, because she comes from a filmmaking background, and her class is all about, okay, how do you take your 400-page book and turn it into an elevator speech that you can give to some lady at a cocktail party that will make her say, here's my card, or call my assistant on Monday. And so that is a difficult process, but it is a really important one, because it helps you kind of, it gets to the core of your story. And she just has a wonderful way of extracting this. Very painful, but wonderful. So if I could recommend one class, and the good thing about Harvard Extension is you don't have to be a degree-seeking student. Like, you can just start taking some classes. And if you were to, sign up for one class in addition to, I think there's like an introductory one that you have to take. If you're going to start somewhere and do one thing as a writer who's just interested in this, I'd highly recommend it. So I'll just go through this really quick. This is called a lookbook. So this is one of the tools she asked us to make. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. I'll just roll through this, and we'll see what you guys think. Can you see I can't see it on mine, but I'm assuming share. Oh, maybe I gotta do something else. Zoom is not always my forte.
I will remove the spotlight just in case that's
there. I think this will do it now.
There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
So this is the lookbook, and it was you do it in all kinds of ways. She obviously did it for films, and she gave us some examples. I said, this is a book, so I should make my lookbook look like a book. So it was just like, if I had a book, what would it look like? And what is it? Where does it kind of stand? And there's some questions that we are encouraged to ask, kind of like, why this book? Why now as the time to publish it? And why you as the person to write it? And so in making this lookbook, I kind of tried to run through those questions and show people some visuals of what it was that we saw in South Sudan, and sort of who the players were at the time. And a lot of these pictures just came out of my cell phone footage at the time. Some were open source or were from the UN files. But getting towards the end of it, I was able to say, okay, so here are the real heroes of the story. It's not me. It's all these people I work with, what we were trying to do, and how peacekeeping, if it's done right, can be great, and how if it's done badly, can make things go horribly wrong. And I think, Danny, we were talking a little bit before everybody else joined, kind of like, when did you know you had to write this story? And this was the when. There was an incident where a lot of women and children were abducted from their village in ethnically motivated violence. And it made me think of the time when 200 schoolgirls were abducted by Boko Haram in Nigeria several years ago. And there was a huge worldwide social media campaign, and Michelle Obama was tweeting about it, and the US actually sent special forces soldiers to try and get them back. And this same thing was happening on my watch, and nothing was happening. The world wasn't aware. The world, if they were aware, they didn't care. And so the disparity between that, like what can I do about this? That was what made me think that I needed to write this book, so that women like this in the future would have a better chance than they had today. So that's what I found the power of kind of the lookbook to be. I'll turn off the screen share now. But hopefully that gives you also a little feel for the story, what's kind of in there, and maybe spark some questions for later in the discussion.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And the picture sort of sparked this question, which is, you're writing about real people, real events, things that have actually happened, people that you actually knew. Obviously, there are some ethical considerations there, which philosophy, you'll have been well versed in that. How did you navigate that, especially when you're discussing the shortcomings of the UN peacekeeper mission or of the military in response to some of these events? Yeah, I'm just curious how you approached that.
So this was a real challenge for me in some ways, and not so much in others. So I would say that, a lot of people, when they're writing their book, they're always talking about their book and they're always kind of throwing it out there on their socials. And I've been actually up until now fairly quiet about this one, in part because I am well aware that there are going to be some people who are very unhappy with the fact that someone is telling this story and is telling the story this way, because and I will leave it to the reader to decide, who is right and who is wrong on some of the moral issues that come up in the story. The only places where and again, this is where I believe, memoir is what happened. It's your version of what happened. And I'm very clear that I think I make a note in the book that this is one of 10 million legitimate perspectives on what happened in South Sudan in 2019 and early 2020. But that this is mine, and it is as honest as it can be. The only places where I reached out sort of for permission was to, there were a couple of people that I sort of dated throughout this time. And to the extent that they showed up in the story, I reached out to them and said, are you comfortable with this depiction of our, interactions? And do you want the name to be changed, or do you want to, just be your first name? And got very positive responses on all that. I did not reach out and ask, generals and senior UN personnel if they liked my characterization of our interactions, because for better or worse, those are, and I have the receipts, so I'm not terribly concerned. But at the same time, it is something you have to be conscious of. And I think I read Tara Westover's book, Educated. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with that, but she grew up actually in kind of a similar way to how I grew up, in sort of a very isolated, highly religious community where she wasn't granted a lot of the rights that we would sort of associate with young men and women, going through their, elementary and high school educations. And if you read to the end of her story, in the back, it basically says that most of the names have been changed of her family members. So they still appear. Her dad, you can tell who her dad is, but his name may be John instead of, whatever it really is, because he didn't, but the story that she's telling about him is her truth of the story. So that is, that's how I handled that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting because, and you mentioned you wrote historical fiction before, but I think you have a lot of liberty with fictional characters that they're not gonna be able to give you a call or send an angry tweet into the internet. Like, when you're dealing with real people, obviously it's a much different situation. So that's just an interesting approach.
Well, I will say that going through this process, though, I've one of the things is by attending other people's, book seminars like this. I went to one with a lady named Severine Atasser. She's worked in kind of the peace and humanitarian sector for a long time. She's written a couple of books about it. But when her first book came out, I think the head of UN peacekeeping claimed that she was as destructive as Muammar Gaddafi. He said she was a terrible person,
Wow.
that she was, and I'm like, okay, that's actually my goal. If I can offend someone that much by just writing the truth, then I'm probably doing okay, and I shouldn't worry too much. So Severine's kind of one of my heroes, and I would say that when as but these are things that if you're writing memoir and if you're writing about troubling events, then certainly I think many writers might grapple with it. And you're right, historical fiction, while it has a sort of the same framework for a writer as memoir does, this is where I felt that, again, I couldn't put a blue flower dress on that woman because I didn't know. And she wasn't a fictional character, she was a real person. And also I think have been very, very on it. And I keep a lot of notes just in the course of my job, and write things down, and diary at the end of the day. So I had a lot of things that I knew, okay, really what was happening, and pictures. And then where I didn't, okay, you use your memory. But I think as a memoirist, you can. I think there was a thousand times. There was a book that came out some years ago, and it was a bit of a scandal because it was a New York Times bestseller. And then it turned out that whilst it was pitched as a memoir and true, it was actually a very, very distorted version of the gentleman's life. So yeah, it's a fine line, but I didn't really have too much concerns whilst I was writing this book.
I think it was at A Million Little Pieces. I
Yes, it
remember
was.
that.
Yep.
Yeah. Because it was Oprah's book club, and then that was a while ago now.
Yep.
Time flies, but
I'm old.
something that I intended to ask right at the beginning, because I know that it's of great concern for a lot of our audience, but we got sidetracked, which is great, is I'm wondering about your path to publication. How did you take this from the initial stages to something that is now being released by a publisher? And if you could just walk us through your journey there.
Sure. So my path to publication is like my path to being in this spotlight, partly just dumb luck, but you make your own luck in some ways. So I had finished up my Harvard classes. I had taken classes I thought were going to be really beneficial. One was Catherine Eden's Art of the Pitch, and there's memoir is an interesting thing. So there's basically three categories of books. There's fiction, nonfiction, and memoir. And for fiction, you kind of have to have the whole draft of Harry Potter before you reach out to an agent. And for nonfiction, you do something very different. You write a book proposal, and you write a couple of sample chapters. And the book proposal is kind of that, why am I the right person? Why is this the story for now? But then you pitch that to agents and editors. And if they say yes, then you write the book. And if they never get around to saying yes, maybe you don't spend a couple of years of your life writing a book. Memoir falls in between. It can be either. You can have the full thing and take it, or you can have a really solid proposal and pitch that. And so what I had coming out of my Harvard creative writing course was basically the bones of a good proposal. The proposal we drafted in class, and the sample chapters that I worked up in classes with Dr. McKetta and some other people. And I went to the Nonfiction Authors Association conference. They had an opportunity to put your name in to kind of pitch the agents. They had a pitch the agents panel, and I think you got 3 minutes. Again, this was COVID, so it was on Zoom. And so I had just come out of Catherine Eden's class, so I had my hook. I had all the stuff to do a perfect pitch. And then being in that pitching session, you could see the difference between people who had just signed up for it, and yep, they had written something that they really loved, but they couldn't do the why this book, why me, why now, hook, synopsis, snappy close. And so out of that, I got 2 requests from agents to send them the full proposal. One of them liked it, and we went from there. That said, I will say that everybody thinks that getting an agent is that's the hard part, right? Life is not always so smooth. So we pitched the book to a lot of big publishers. We got a lot of very kind rejections. And as the level of the advance started to go down, you could definitely because this lady, I mean, that's how she makes her money, is her commission on these things. And she basically she did get it placed with Potomac Books, which is actually a press that I've read their books before, really liked them. There's a great one of the great conflict memoirs of all time, I believe, is published by them. So I was very happy with the placement, but basically as soon as the foot was in the door, she pulled out of the process, and it was on me then to negotiate the details of the contract with the publishing house. And it was definitely a learning experience. Probably not something most people need to worry about. But so then I was in the traditional publishing process, and the thing that I will say that you get with the traditional publishing process is some degree of oversight, some degree of support, the prestige of having, a traditionally published book. In this case, what I gave up, and I knew this was going to be the case going into it to an extent, is sort of the flash to bang. So if you're self-publishing or hybrid publishing, once you can get the final draft, and once you can get it through a copy editor, you can pretty much go to press with print on demand or KDP. There's various, that's not necessarily going to happen with a traditional publisher. So this, in some ways, I felt this was a time-sensitive story, and I really wanted it out there. And I think it is now 2025. Started writing, obviously the events happened in 2020. So a 5-year lag time, that's something that people should be aware of. And for many people, it may not be an issue at all. But I would say that was my big sort of takeaway. And there's a great interview I'll recommend between Tim Ferriss and Hugh Howey. Hugh Howey has done kind of all versions of publishing, and he leans very heavily towards the self in many ways for artistic control and kind of control over the process. But yes, and then once you're in the process, there are definitely some things I learned about that I'm happy to talk about in terms of where you should stress and where you should put a little more attention, and what you might want to outsource, that I've kind of learned the hard way. But yeah.
So that's great. And that's the publishing, which is, I think, so helpful, because it's not the most transparent process, I think, and it's something that is very daunting for a lot of people. So it's great to hear experiences from somebody who's actually gone through the process. But of course, to get to that point, you have to have written a book before they can publish it.
Yep.
So I was wondering if you could just walk us through a little bit your process for organizing the book. Were you outlining extensively? Were you more pulling, especially I think from a memoir perspective, how did you decide the chronology that you wanted to present things in, and so on?
So that's a great question. And with memoir, you do have the ability to, I mean, you can tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but you can also sequence things, right? So you could start at the end, you could start in the middle. I think Dr. McKenna had a great quote that actually shows up in the book, is that what you can't do is say, they lived happily ever after, and then they all died. The memoir always ends in the middle. Your life goes on, and you've got to deal with, like, how do you put that in the book? In my case, I chose to go fairly chronologically because I felt that it worked for this story. It starts with an interesting kind of the first chapter is a little bit, some people have asked questions about it, but again, it is relatively sequential. That was my choice. And then in terms of the writing process, the good thing about doing a book this way, and even if you were going to do your memoir start to finish and just take it to the publisher when you had the full thing, I would still recommend doing the book proposal process, because one of the things that you do is you do a chapter outline. So here's my proposed table of contents. And then for me, each of those chapters, so I gave them each a snappy heading. Okay, and then they were each, I think originally I said I'd make each chapter be a week. So I got roughly 50 chapters, and then if I have so many pages in the book, that tells me how many pages I can devote to any given week. But then when you look at the real story, you say, okay, some weeks were really involved, and some weeks not much happened. So then you kind of start blurring boundaries a bit. And then as you go through the revision process, some things drop out, some chapter titles change. But that was more or less my flow for in terms of I'm afraid that Dr. McKenna in her classes, she says, have your sort of your folder of all things, and so I have a giant folder of all things, and there was Blue Helmet 2022 and Blue Helmet 2024 and Blue Helmet Revision 3, and so it builds up. And but yes, my thing was sort of start with what I had, write quickly and from the heart. If you come to something where I didn't really remember exactly, you just put a placeholder in and then go back and do the research and come back and fill that in later. Bibliography, again, this is one of the different things too. So I think we had talked a little bit before we turned the camera on about the fact that the press that I got picked up with is an imprint that focuses on memoir and biography and military history, but they're an imprint of a university press. So they weren't part of the university press when they were originally founded. They were bought up later, but because their overarching editorial staff still comes very much from sort of a university background, this has a lot more, kind of endnotes. But this ended up being a story where, again, because I said I have to be able to justify some of the things I'm saying, there are things like, this is the link to the news, this is the link to where somebody else has said that this is a problem. So bibliography has never been my strong suit. So toward the end, there was a lot of going back and, where was that link and how do I format in the Chicago style, et cetera, et cetera. And Chicago's the worst style. Sorry, Chicago, but you're terrible.
I'm sure Chicago doesn't take it personally.
I'm sure they don't.
You mentioned your snappy chapter titles, and I did really appreciate those as I was going through. The Land That Time Forgot, I thought was such a great in particular. But
Sorry,
that
Time Magazine, but you did.
Yeah. That reminds me of your epigraphs too, the at the beginning of each chapter, and there are some really powerful ones. The one in particular that I highlighted, it was peacekeeping is not a job suited to soldiers, but a job only soldiers can do. And I thought that was such a great way to sort of introduce that chapter, but it made me curious, how did you choose those little snippets at the beginning and sort of go through that process of selecting them?
So that's a great question. Some of them I already kind of knew what was going to go in there, and then some of them was like, okay, here's what's going on in the chapter. What's an epigraph that sets the stage? So they're a bit of a combination. So that's a great quote. He was actually the second Secretary General of the United Nations who died tragically in Africa as a result of people who didn't like what he was doing in peacekeeping. And I thought it perfectly encapsulates the kind of the tension between armed men with guns trying to make life safe for other people. And then there were chapters where there's one, you sort of, if you've read the literature of whatever you're working on, and I like the epigraph. I'm trying to remember who has done it in the past really well. John Krakauer, I think. Most of his books use an epigraph. He actually sometimes has multiple epigraphs at the beginning of the chapters. I like to keep it to one. I just feel it's a good way to set the scene and bring in a little bit of like, this is not just you, especially if you're kind of a first-time author. Like if I was Neil Gaiman, I wouldn't need epigraphs. Well, I wouldn't be writing stuff that needed epigraphs probably. But it just gives you a little more like, oh, this guy's saying this in the chapter, but Prince Zaid said something very similar at the beginning of the chapter. So maybe Carpenter's not so off the path after all. And then some were quotes from, I think there's a couple of quotes from the generals of something that happened during that time, or a quote from an individual who when he was young, said this very, optimistic, idealistic thing. And then when he was actually in power, did something completely different. And it's like, okay, let me frame how they read about him in the now with the person he was 10 years ago when he wrote, this is how it should be. So.
That's so interesting. And like I said, I think you made such good and interesting choices that really added something, and that I'm really appreciating as I'm going through it. We're running a little short on time. I want to make sure that we have time to open it up for questions. But I did want to ask, what's next? Now you have this book coming out, and it comes out March
March 1st.
Oh, March 1st. Okay, perfect. So March 1st. Yep. So you've got this book out now. So where are you going to go from here?
Well, I think that there's a lot of places I could go. I'm a bit torn. I have a novel that again is finished and completely different vein. A Victorian Georgian era adventure. And I have some short stories that are in need of completing, probably a short story collection that needs putting together, a couple of novellas that need finishing and publishing. What I'm being told constantly by my marketing boss and my sisters is you got to build your platform as the UN guy. There's this whole second UN book and probably a PhD thesis on why we as humanity need to step away from our warlike behavior. So the answer is probably a lot of multitasking. Probably, yeah. Oh, and there's a biography of a very interesting Victorian era power couple, Lady Florentia Sale and her husband, Fighting Bob. So a great diarist, by the way, Lady Sale. She documented the British catastrophe in Afghanistan from the first person. So yeah, I guess time will tell. And then the other thing, though, that I will say, and I think this is probably it's certainly something many people have done because I benefited from it, is as I finish out kind of the life cycle of this book from, starting it to getting the agent to the publishing to the marketing, is to put some of my lessons learned in print on the web in the form of a blog or something that's accessible for others to kind of learn from my mistakes and maybe pick up the tools that have benefited me along the way. So that's a long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
So you've got one or two different directions you can go.
Yeah. But the other thing that I will be doing is supporting my wife's book. So she has long intended, she's a science communicator. She has a book on what makes for good science communication, which I think is just good communication in general. So my goal throughout this year is really to kind of support her getting that launched as well.
That's awesome. As part of a husband and wife supporting each other writing team, I think that's fantastic. Really, really, really quick in like 1 minute. I did just want to mention your nonprofit and if you could just give us a quick
Sure.
just brief overview of it. I know I'm putting you on the spot for like a 30-second overview, but
well, this goes back to that ethical question from the beginning. So one of the ethical questions I did realize I had was, how very dare I profit from the misery of others? Because in some parts, this story is very much about the misery of others. And I'm not, scraping the bottom of the barrel. I don't, need every penny. And probably not going to make a lot of money from this book anyway, but I didn't really feel like I should be taking money for writing this story. So what I said was, let me instead take my royalties and put it into something that I believe can be a force for good. And what I thought that needed to be was a nonprofit that didn't seem to exist, which was one specifically focused on eliminating this idea that war is something that has always been with humanity and will always be with humanity. We've had some other, cultural institutions. My big thing is sort of slavery has long been associated with war. For many thousands of years, they were kind of co-linked. And then sometime around the 1800s, roughly, we more or less within the span of a couple of decades, did away worldwide with the idea that slavery was acceptable. It still happens, but you don't have people getting up and making speeches at the UN about why they need to enslave some other people. So yeah, that was the impetus. And again, that's the other thing I'll be doing is I have to do a lot of writing to keep that platform boosted. So, but anybody who wants to join me, I'm definitely, one of the things was bring in other voices, diverse voices, diverse perspectives. Maybe there are perspectives who legitimately make a case that they have to have the war for some reason. And so we can have that conversation. So to create a platform for that and to fund that, hopefully to fund some graduate education for people from places like South Sudan, because there are many wonderful people who just don't get the same opportunities that we do. And many of them, sadly, are on the African continent.
That's awesome. And thank you so much for sharing and for starting that. It's really an incredible initiative. And I do want to open it up to questions because I see the chat lighting up. I don't know what's going on in there, but if anybody has any questions, now is the time.
So that's mostly my bad. I'm like, oh, this is so quotable. I've just been quoting you in the chat so we can reference it later. And people have been reacting to it. But I do think that this would be a great opportunity going off of the World Without War and, getting different perspectives and potential volunteers for that. We have with us here a few members of the Harvard Extension School Veteran Student Society that if they're available, maybe they could introduce themselves. I do see Mike, the president, which I think would be great if you could maybe just say a few words and yeah.
Yeah, I'm Mike. I'm president of the Veteran Student Society here. Edward, I just want to say thank you so much for coming to talk to us. You were probably the first blue helmet I've ever met. So that to me, like I knew they existed. I've never encountered
I didn't
one.
know that I didn't know America sent peacekeepers until they asked me to be one. So
I did, but I think I thought it was such a rare detail that you'd get put on that nobody ever. I've met more members of Delta Force than I've ever met any blue helmets. You know what I'm saying? So It's such a rare thing that I just never thought I'd come across one. So I'm curious though too, and I'm trying to figure out what the mission's like. Is it like one big civil affairs mission, or is it is there actual combat involved too?
Oh, it varies by mission, and the book will go into this a little bit. So there have been a lot of peacekeeping missions throughout the world. The Big Five, they were called the Big Five. It's reduced now. Mali was very kinetic. Mali was basically sort of Afghanistan light, a Islamic fundamentalist organization on one side, very used to using IEDs and the standard that tactic that you probably have seen other places. DRC is a proxy war, really. It's very misunderstood, but a proxy war in large part between Uganda and Rwanda for control of the mineral resources of that country. South Sudan was what happens when you kind of break off a state that fights for and gets independence, but then the people at the top are just a bunch of warlords who had gotten together to get independence, and their one kind of charismatic political leader has died. So they've gone back to kind of an ethnic, fighting and scrabbling for resources. So South Sudan, when I was there, was less kinetic in the sort of the enemy firing at us. At that point, the UN was not a target. Mali, the UN was very much a target because it was in the middle of an unpopular government, the Islamics on one side, and then the separate tribal entity, the Tuareg, who just want to be tribesmen and just want people to leave them alone. So it depends, it's region to region. And then there's places there's a big peacekeeping mission it's ANISOM. So Somalia, peacekeeping didn't necessarily stop there. The West pulled out, and the African Union puts the peacekeepers, who are very kinetic and up against al-Shabaab. So It does vary a lot place to place. When I was in South Sudan, the kinetics were not directed towards us. They were directed toward civilians. And a big part of my book is about why I feel we did not do what we needed to do to get out in between that. But the mission is not a civil affairs organization. It is battalions. The central core is these infantry battalions. They're basically medium infantry battalions, mechanized or motorized, but they come from different places. So Ethiopia, their motorized battalion is equipped a lot differently than China's mechanized battalion. On the other hand, the Ethiopians are used to operating in East Africa with the equipment they have, fighting the kind of battles you fight, where the Chinese peacekeeping battalion is not necessarily. And then it's you have the force headquarters, but it's 14,000 troops, commanded by a 3-star general, who's usually from one of the big peacekeeping contributors. Ours was from India. He'll have a deputy force commander, a 2-star, and then my boss was a 1-star from Norway. So, but I think hopefully that's what the book kind of does is, and that's what I originally thought was, this is all I thought the book was going to be, was just like this is what I didn't know about peacekeeping. And then there was a sharp left turn toward the end that goes some bad places, but hopefully that answers the question.
It does answer your question. So I just want to say again, thank you for being here. Thank you for your service doing this. It's fascinating.
Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Wait to read the book here.
Thanks,
and
Mike.
I just want to give a shout out to my friend Jess Richardson and her husband floating around the background. Some good friends of mine from the Naval Postgraduate School. Haven't seen each other in way too long, but hopefully I'll see them as I pass through Hawaii on my way to the States a little bit later this year. So shaka to you, girl.
That's great. I would love to pass through Hawaii, but coming from Buffalo, New York, it's not exactly
Oh, I think if you're in Buffalo, New York, you need to go to Hawaii.
Well, yeah, that's fair. Especially right now with sleety ice storms. Were there any other questions? From the chat, we've got, how do you stay motivated and keep yourself accountable?
Oh, that's how I keep myself accountable. I've tried all kinds of different things. I tried actually, my wife's got a really good friend. She's one of those sort of people you can kind of trust with your life and probably your money. There was a time when I was giving her like a bunch of money at the beginning of the week and saying, only Venmo this back to me if I check off these lists of my tasks, like got to pay myself to write. So I tried that. It worked somewhat. Try the reward system. Dr. Marquetta has this, she's a great person. Again, you can take her classes through Harvard, which is what I did. I know she does a book year where she brings in, I think, maybe 20 or 30 people a year and kind of mentors them through a very similar process that I got to go through with her at Harvard. But she talks about like setting yourself up. And one of the things, like, you have your place to write, and that's where you go to write. But then you have your reward. Like in our case, it's Pepsi Max. Like we get to drink the Pepsi Max if we're writing, but we don't get it if we're not writing. So I've tried everything. If you know if anybody here knows the answer, please tell me, because I'm a bit ADD, a bit tendency to multitask and take too many things on at once. But I found that's actually the other thing I found was the power of going through the Harvard creative writing literature. Was it gave me the framework that said, okay, I have to have an 8-page short story by Friday. Like I have to. I can't not get I'm one of those people, I can't not get the A. So that means that I will get the thing done. Otherwise, it'll just be part of the TB written and, maybe have a great start and stop halfway through. So some people need frameworks. I definitely need frameworks. And that's, again, why I'm probably looking at doing a PhD, is, again, just to get myself a framework to do the big hard writing.
I love that, and particularly the idea of paying yourself by having someone basically hold it in escrow for you. I think that's a fantastic idea that I need to steal immediately. Because yeah, I think that it's so difficult, especially when your brain wants to go in all of these different places. Another question from the chat is, do you plan on getting another agent?
That's a good question. So one of the interesting things is, once you have an editor, And it depends on how things work with your press. So I'm going to be doing a book signing in Mobile, Alabama at a military history conference with my project editor, Taylor Gilreath from, actually, no, she's my acquisitions editor from Potomac. So one of the things I'll talk to her about is, okay, so now that you've published one of my books, can I just pitch you, is the door open? Can I just pitch you my next idea? Because not every idea will be in Potomac swim lane, right? I have my my Mr. Wickham period adventure, so that's not their jam. They're not fiction publishers. If I wanted to get an agent for fiction, I'd be right back to the drawing board. I could probably go back to the agent I have, but I don't, I don't, it's a tricky one because she's kind of opted out whilst she still gets her commission, which is fine. But she is extremely qualified, and I might be a much better candidate for her now than I was actually when we were first going through the process. So the answer is TBD. And the other question is, now I've got to look at, okay, so I've got this traditionally published book. What does whatever book I'm going to write need an agent? Or would it be best if I brought it to the world in another format? And I would say that that's the question. If I was going to throw one out to the crowd, I would just ask if anybody has thoughts on AI in writing and kind of the NFT Web3. I know, I think it was AC Lowry talked a bit about that in his spotlight. It's something that I've dabbled with a lot. Interestingly enough, I've sold 3-4 books this week as kind of the NFT. Buy this NFT and it gets you the copy of the book shipped to you directly. But it's because I have networks in that space. So it's one of those things that it has not been well developed, but there are some big names in it. Neil Strauss had an NFT book project. Neil Stevenson has a whole Lamina One blockchain. It's interesting. And then obviously the growth of AI. I wrote a short story about an AI writer while I was in Harvard, and it has not yet been published, but I'm like, if I don't get this out sooner or later, then it's going to be overrun by reality. So does anybody in the crowd, are you worried about AI's effect on writing, the writing industry?
From the chat, we have robots are taking over the world. So yes, just for the benefit of our future viewers.
No, it's it's something that definitely probably in our writing conferences in the future, if it's not being talked about. I have a niece who was in college at the time and a couple of sisters who teach. And when ChatGPT first came out, it was like, we got to lock everybody in rooms and give them pencils. And like, what was Google and what was Wikipedia when we were first coming up? And it's just becoming sort of, I think, adapting to it and becoming an early adopter and looking for the strengths and weaknesses will be interesting. I'll tell you something I've used it for this week was, hey, I'm doing an Amazon, an Amazon ad, and I have 150 characters to use. And I've got these 280 word like synopses of the books. How do I get it down to the best 150? Well, I tried my very best, and my wife took her stab, and I said, hey, computer, take your stab. And between the three of them could come up with something that was better than maybe any of us. Can AI write my pitch? Careful. It can give you advice, perhaps. It can draft things. I'm trying to think what I use it for the other day. I did something where, it was doing a comparative. So this was one of the things. This is my last. I think we're close to being out of time. One of the things with working with a traditional publisher, you have to really pay attention to some things. So when the book came out, and they're like, it's up on Amazon. I went and looked at it. Yes, it was. The Kindle price was the exact same as the hardcover price. And as a Kindle aficionado, I'm like, but nobody wants to pay the same for a kid. Like, it should be about half. It should be like $16.99. But that's not how the university press does its thing. So I had to go back to them and say, let me give you the reason to do this. And where before I would have done my own comparative analysis, like, here's my comparables, here's what they're going for, blah, blah, blah. In this case, I just said, hey, ChatGPT, here's my list of book titles. Can you do me a quick comparable analysis of, and it spit it out. And yes, I was able to then, the exact same work I would have done myself, but it wouldn't be with a spreadsheet, going and looking at the screen, 1699, 34, totaling it up, averaging it out, writing my explanation of why customers, and it could do the exact same thing in 30 seconds that I would have done in 30 minutes. So that's where I think that you can potentially have some early wins.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I think that that's, like you said, if it's not something that people are talking about now, which I think it is, but it will be, because absolutely it's part of the conversation. And it's interesting too. I started looking yesterday. I was going through some different places that accept submissions without agents, and all of them had a notice that if you have used any AI in the generation of your work, including in the like outlining phase, we don't want it. And kind of going through, yeah. So it's really interesting to kind of see, and I think that that's very much a fear response. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes from there. I do want to just wrap up, and we can, if you have a little bit of time, Edward, maybe we can stay after, but I want to let people go who need to go. But I just wanted to say one more time, thank you so much. This has been just fantastic. And I really especially appreciate you providing us with an advanced copy of the book, because I have been very much enjoying it. And it's just fantastic. And I'm so excited for it to be out in the world and for people to be able to read it. And I think it's such an important story that you're telling. So for everyone, we will have links to pre-order and to connect with Edward in the YouTube caption section, information section. And I know Nat also put it in the comments for the people who are here live. But yeah, once again, Edward, just thank you so much. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been really wonderful. And again, just a lovely opportunity, but also so nice to be back on Zoom with my Harvard writing tribe. I've missed it a lot. So.
Awesome. All right. I am going to end the recording.